This event took place back when I was in college, way before there were things like cell phones. I was an undergraduate attending a school in the Appalachian Mountains. The school was in a small town, and I soon realized that the townies, people who grew up there, didn't care much for us students. I was a junior then, and it happened during a cold winter. I heard a story about a certain townie who frequented a popular bar called the Club, a place visited by both students and townies. As the story goes, this guy would come out on Saturday evenings to pick fights with students. One night, he joined a table uninvited, where a group of students were drinking beer. He just sat there, silent and unwelcome. Eventually, he grabbed the thigh of a male student. When the student gripped his arm and told him to let go, the townie assaulted them. Supposedly, the students ended up in the hospital due to injuries sustained during the beating. Being a townie, the bar owner didn't do anything about it. Hearing this story made me determined to teach the townie a lesson. My dad raised me not to be a victim and to look out for my friends. I played pool and poker to help myself through school, so I knew how to handle myself. Knowing the townie liked to punch victims in the solar plexus, I taped some magazines around my torso with electrical tape. I also put an empty Coke bottle in my jacket pocket. I waited until around 10 p.m., then headed to the bar. We found a table and left the chair beside me empty. We were enjoying a cold pitcher of Pabst when one of my friends told me the townie had arrived. We made sure not to look at him and kept drinking. Eventually, he came over and sat beside me in the empty chair. Casually, I turned to look at him and smiled. Sure enough, he immediately grabbed my leg. "Hey there, fella," he said, smiling. I looked at him, smiling back as I took another sip of beer. He had a rugged grip on my thigh as he stared at me, not saying a word. "You certainly aren't a shy one," I said, and all my friends laughed. The bar had grown silent. Everyone was watching. I had a nice pinch of Copenhagen snuff between my cheek and gums. I spit it into one of his eyes, causing him to close, both involuntarily. Immediately, I punched him in the throat as hard as I could, knocking him backward. He fell out of his seat, landing flat on his back. We stepped out into the back alley, followed by the townie. His eyes blazed with anger as he quickly approached me. He swung at me, but I blocked it and pulled out the Coke bottle, gripping it by the neck. I swung back hard, landing a savage blow on his thick skull. The bottle connected with a satisfying thud. His head snapped back, and he stumbled. I kicked his legs out from under him. We circled him and started kicking him with our steel-toed Doc Martens. He tried to get up, but we just kept kicking him, working up a good sweat. He must have tried not to yell or scream, but soon enough, he started crying like a baby. This went on for quite a while until we eventually heard sirens approaching. "Let's go," I shouted, and we bolted out of there. Later, we were told an ambulance came to the bar to cart off the unconscious townie on a stretcher. We didn't return to the club anytime soon. The following year, I think I saw the townie sitting in a wheelchair at the bar. He wasn't so big anymore and trembled a lot. Eventually, he looked my way but immediately broke eye contact. He didn't say a word. Oh well, I thought. He brought it on himself. There are consequences to your actions. But I do kind of feel bad. The story I'm about to share takes place on two different occasions. My grandparents live in rural southern Ohio, near the edge of the Appalachian Trail. Growing up, you always heard ghost stories about what happens out there when the sun goes down. It's vital to describe the layout of my grandparents' property so everyone understands this story. Their house sits on 5 acres, surrounded by thick woods all around. On the property, 7 different trails lead around my grandparents' house, which we usually used for hunting and other activities. One day, my brother and I decided to walk the trails. We enjoyed riding a 4-wheeler and taking in the scenery we always loved. My grandparents' property was incredibly secluded. There were no neighbors for miles, and the only property that backed up to theirs was a preserve. There was a trail we often used that split into two other trails. The trail to the left loops back to the house, while the one on the right takes you down to the creek, where you can sit and watch wildlife. My brother and I decided to head to the creek to look for animals and collect the remarkable rocks I love to find. To get down to the creek at the split, we had to navigate through thick brush and trees, so we ditched the four-wheeler and went on foot. The trail down to the creek is about a mile long. The sun shone through the trees, and it was a crisp fall evening with a slight breeze. We wasted no time and eventually reached the creek. We walked alongside the water for about 15 minutes, searching for cool rocks. As we were walking, we stumbled across a broken-down shed that neither my brother nor I had ever seen before. It's important to mention that my grandparents' property has markers showing where their land begins and ends. Standing on the left side of the creek, we saw the shed on the opposite side. My brother and I exchanged confused looks, but eventually, he got distracted and continued walking down the creek. I, however, felt drawn to the shed as if something was compelling me to go inside. I called out to my brother and said, "Jay, I think we should check this out some more. Something inside me wants to go in there." My brother, never a fan of anything remotely scary, wanted no part of it. Seeing the rundown shed, which looked like it was falling apart, didn't interest him at all. "We are not going in there," he said. I chuckled because he was right. It probably wasn't the best idea as the sun was starting to set. We collected our rocks and returned to the house. The next weekend, my boyfriend came to visit. I told him about the creepy shed my brother and I had stumbled upon and how I felt compelled to go inside. That was all it took to convince him, and soon we were heading back to the creek. My brother stayed behind, saying, "If you guys don't come back, I told you so." My boyfriend and I laughed it off. We dressed in overalls and brought flashlights since we didn't take the four-wheeler. We had about 2 hours until sunset. When we reached the creek and walked the same path I had taken with my brother, I was shocked and confused to find no sign of the shed. Frantic, I started looking around, saying, "What? How? I swear it was here." We walked further, venturing away from my grandparents' house, but still, there was no shed. Time slipped away, and soon we had only about 15 minutes of light left. Determined to prove myself right, I pulled out a flashlight. We jumped across the creek to the other side and began walking back the way we came. As we were talking, the sun fully set, and everything fell silent, including my boyfriend. Mid-conversation, he stopped dead in his tracks. I asked, "What's going on?" He whispered, "Listen to me closely. When I count to 3, we're going to jump to the other side of the creek, and we're going to run as fast as we can. Don't stop and don't look back. Got it?" My heart sank, but I didn't question him. I just prepared to run. 1, 2, 3. We sprinted as fast as we could. I ran ahead of him, but I heard more than just our footsteps. Something was chasing us. Abandoning the trail, we ran straight through the woods. When we finally reached the house, we were gasping for air, scratched up from the thick brush. Inside, my boyfriend winced in pain, gripping his back. My grandma lifted his shirt and gasped. 3 long scratches ran from his shoulder to his lower back, as if something had swiped at him. To this day, I still don't know what we encountered. From one Appalachian to another, don't go looking for something you don't want to find. This experience still keeps me up at night. I've never had paranormal experiences, but I can't really explain this one. I'm in college, and 7 other people from my school and I went on a backpacking trip. We had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Forest, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold, and everything was still pretty much dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite. There were a couple of other groups of people as well, so we weren't entirely alone. A few of them were friendly older couples and 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was relatively spread out, so we set up camp further away. I have always sensed the energy of places, and the energy in this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Eerie, if you will. Each of us had individual, one-person tents, and we formed a cluster at the site, with my tent in the back so no one was behind me. Our cluster was next to the forest because the backpacking site was like a big, cleared-off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward. I'm dead asleep. It's sometime around 2 a.m., and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be any deer or dog. It sounded just like two legs, and I cannot make this up. This creature, this person, whatever it was, circled my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent and then just stopping, and then would move on to walking around the rest of our camps. I could hear a human-like breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a light heaving. I began to shake. I was too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. Out of nowhere, I saw an illuminated shape from my tent. Although I couldn't tell where it was or how this light was coming in, I was just too terrified to move. It was like a warm glow. I might have assumed it was someone's flashlight, except no one was moving. I was paralyzed in fear and simply couldn't believe it was any animal. At some point, I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy footsteps circling. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted she did hear footsteps and weird noises as well, realizing it was bizarre and she should have gone out and investigated. But she had been a bit dizzy from walking and being in the heat all day. One of the boys in the group said he also noticed that light come on but thought it was just somebody else going to the bathroom. Not a single person in this group went up to go to the bathroom or turned on a light all night. I've heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, and now I believe it. Has anybody else had a similar experience? When I was a kid, in my early preteens, to be exact, I was pretty timid. We lived in a mobile home in rural Appalachia, and whenever I heard my stepdad wake up and make breakfast in the wee hours of the morning, I would creep out of my bedroom and scurry across the house so I could climb into bed with my mom. One morning, around 3:30 a.m., my mom had gotten up with my stepdad. She told me to climb into bed, saying she would join me later. So I did as I was told. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but something woke me up. It was still dark out, and something just felt weird. When I pried my eyes open, a little girl stood by the edge of the bed. Her face was obscured by dark, dirty, almost singed-looking hair. She wore what looked like a feed sack dress. I rubbed my eyes, but the little girl was still there. I rolled over, then turned back around, and she was gone. It was odd that I didn't freak out, because at that age, I was honestly scared of my own shadow. I decided it must have been some sort of weird dream and went back to sleep. When I woke up later that morning, I told my mom about it. Typically, she would reassure me that it was just a bad dream. But this time, she didn't. Instead, she grew silent. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't ask any more questions, until a pastor showed up at the house the next day. The old man had the posture of a candy cane, and I couldn't imagine how he would manage as he struggled to hang prayer cloths above the doors. I knew something was up. My mom wasn't particularly religious, so his visit seemed strange. After the elderly gentleman left, I pressed my mom harder. She revealed that my stepdad had been seeing the same thing for weeks. She also told me that through some research, my aunt and grandma had discovered that the place where our home stood was the location of a hay barn fire in the 1930s. The fire was presumably started by a little girl who could have been the same age as the one I saw. Her younger brother was involved as well, and both perished in the fire. The area had been a coal camp, places typically full of tragedy and poverty during the early to mid-1900s. The visits from the little girl stopped after the pastor's visit. I've been trying to understand why. I didn't feel that whatever I saw was particularly malicious, and I think that's why I wasn't scared. However, later that year, my stepdad went ginseng hunting several times around our home. He said he could tell there was something underneath the plants, so he cleared the area. What he found, he believes, was the little girl's grave. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.